Hello, and welcome to Glory Be. Interesting people and how they pray.
Each week, we chat with interesting people about their lives, their work, and how they pray. I'm Sharon Hanish.
And Father Vince Fernandez, and we're joined by our producer, Mike Malcolm.
Our guest today is Archbishop Peter Wells, the Apostolic Nuncio of South Africa, Botswana, Lewsootu, Namibia, and Swaziland, and the Titular Archbishop of Marcianapolis. Archbishop Wells was born and raised in Oklahoma and is the oldest of 5 children. He was ordained to the priesthood for the Diocese of Tulsa in 1991 and served in the diocese as associate pastor at Holy Family Cathedral. In 1999, Archbishop Wells entered the Vatican Diplomatic Corps, worked in Nigeria, and in 2002 returned to Rome to work in the section for General Affairs of the Secretariat of State. He was named Assessor of General Affairs in 2009. In 2016, he was ordained an archbishop and appointed to his current position. He holds degrees in letters from St. Meinrad Seminary College, a baccalaureate from the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, a licentiate from the John Paul II Institute for Studies on Marriage and the Family, and a licentiate and doctorate in Canon Law from the Pontifical Gregorian University. Welcome, Archbishop Wells. We're so happy. As for those who are listening, we also want to say that Father Vince and Mike Malcolm and I are also dear friends of Archbishop Wells. I think Mike was hired to work at Holy Family by Archbishop Wells. Archbishop Wells taught me philosophy as I was preparing to go to study theology. And, fascinating fun fact, Father Vince Fernandez got to hold the microphone for the Pope at your Archbishop ordination. So welcome.
All 3 of you have a connection.
We all have a connection.
For good or for bad.
So, I know, for good or bad. So how are things going in your part of the world? We are zooming into Africa right now, in Pretoria, right? And I noticed,
Exactly.
like, in the news, you know, we're hearing about riots, we're hearing about COVID. Tell us about how your past year has been.
Well, as you've read in the newspapers and probably seen on television, we have gone through some challenging times in the last 18 months. We were hit hard by the pandemic for a number of reasons, partly because of so many people here with comorbidities. And also, you know, we have very high HIV/AIDS rates in this part of the world. And so people already had immune systems which were suppressed. And then also just because of the poverty that exists here and the problems that we have, the pandemic has really raged through here. We're now in the middle of our 3rd wave. It has been a very difficult wave, and we are still rather slow on our vaccinations. They're doing better now, but they just haven't had enough vaccinations available for the amount of people that need them. So it has been a challenge. And then on top of this, there was, a bit of unrest, which came for any number of issues, was partially because of just the social economic situation, a lot of it which has been brought on by the pandemic. And the pandemic has caused a food security crisis here. People don't know where they're going to get their next meal. And then, of course, there was always, as you see in those kind of situations, there were people that joined in, criminal elements and thuggery, as they call it here, which joined in. So it made for a very difficult last few weeks. But things seem to have been stabilized, at least right now. And food supplies are reopening again, and people tend to be moving. And it seems like the pandemic also, this wave has started to decline a bit in the last week. The numbers are going down. So hopefully we'll be able to get a hand on all these things and move forward. Part of the problem, too, is that we're also in the middle of winter here, and it's been a particularly cold winter in the last few weeks, which also exacerbates the problem, especially with the pandemic.
Now, you mentioned before we got started that you actually have had COVID twice.
Yes, I've had COVID, yes. I've been one of the victims, so... Anyhow, but I was lucky that I did not have bad cases of COVID, and now I've had the first injection, and so waiting for the second vaccine. So,
oh, well, that's great news. You know, our podcast is called Interesting People and How They Pray, so we're on the interesting person part of the podcast. You're from Oklahoma. You're one of 5 children. You know, Sister Barbara Austin, who's a mutual friend, she always talks about how she would see you at the country club playing golf in Guthrie. She has that memory. So tell us, what did you plan to do before you decided to go to the seminary? Talk about your vocation story.
Well, my vocation story is rather normal. There were no fireworks or anything like that, or this sudden voice in the darkness calling me. We always grew up in a family that was close to the church, and my mother used to be, when we lived in Bristol, for instance, she was the DRE there. My mother taught in the Catholic school there in Guthrie. My brother and I both were altar servers. All of my brothers, except for one, I think, were served at Mass. Maybe all of us did. All of us, I guess, served at Mass. And but my brother that's just right below me, he and I were serving in Tulsa. I remember very clearly, in fact, one of our first, when we were very young, and Archbishop Quinn was celebrating a Holy Thursday Mass in Tulsa at the Civic Center, I believe, and they called us and asked us to come and serve. It was a big thrill as a young kid. And so we were always grew up in a Catholic family. I was thinking, though, when I was young, I wanted to be, I really wanted to be a doctor. And so that's what I had begun with my studies. I was doing pre-med. But I always had this kind of a tugging feeling that maybe I wanted to do something different. Maybe I wanted to be a priest. I think the first time I probably ever thought about it was serving a Mass, actually. And so after a few years, I decided I would try the seminary. And that was kind of the idea, just to try the seminary and see if I liked it. I wasn't sure about it. But sure enough, I went. And I have to be honest with you, after I'd been for a short time, I realized that this was really what I was being called to do. And so the rest is history. I went through, and I loved my seminary years. I met so many wonderful people, and really came to know and love the church even more than I already did, and to understand it in a way that I hadn't before. So that's kind of my vocation story. But as you said, I'm born, bred Oklahoma boy. Both my families have been in Oklahoma for years. In fact, Sharon, your mom and my mom went to school together. So yes. We have old Catholic roots in Oklahoma, and both sides of my family, both my parents have been in Oklahoma for generations. My dad's family since the run. So
my family too, since the run. Some part of my family, yeah. So we could be related.
We could be. You never know. I think we were so few Catholics in Oklahoma that at one time or another, probably one of our cousins was married to another cousin.
Well, I love Oklahoma, and I think we have produced some outstanding priests, and you're one of them. So you've done a lot of interesting things for an Oklahoma priest. You did serve here for a short time. You had the privilege of working with 3 popes. I've always wanted to ask you this. What was that like? Were you nervous? Were you starstruck? Do you have any interesting stories about the popes?
Well, not really. I think I will say this, though. I think that anytime you are in that fortunate position, which I was in for many years, that there was never a time that I wasn't with the Pope that I wasn't a bit starstruck, for lack of a better term. It's amazing that even as many times as you've been with the person, you come to a point and you can even get a little tongue-tied or whatever. So that never really went away. And even now when I go back to Rome, for instance, I get to see the Pope, and still then you're always a little bit, nervous. It's the Pope. So, yeah, I would say that it's such a privilege and it's such an honor to be blessed like that. And I think for a priest in particular to work so close to the successor of Peter and to be able to serve in that manner is a real grace, and it's a real honor. So.
What did your job entail in terms of working in the Secretariat of State and being an assessor? That's something I think
I had a lot of different jobs there. My first job was working in the English section, of course, and I worked mainly with in texts and translations of texts, and helping with drafting correspondence, et cetera. That's where the main, because the Holy See as an international body has to work in many different languages simultaneously. So all of the major languages have a section within the Secretariat of State, and I worked in the English section, obviously. When I became assessor, it was a different type of work. They're kind of like, in a sense, I always said it was kind of like being the chancellor of the Vatican, in a sense, because all of the major documents would pass through to make sure they were in the proper genre. And you dealt with a lot of correspondence. A lot of people write to the Pope, and the assessor would sign a lot of the letters in the name of the Pope to respond to people who had asked for prayers or for blessings or whatever. So a lot of it was that type of work. And then also you have, you deal with a lot of other things regarding proper procedures, et cetera, how to run the office efficiently, making sure that the work flows. So that was part of the job. It was a very kind of a bureaucratic job in a way. But I never like to think of it as I always like to think of when we work with the church, even if you're in a job that requires you to be kind of a bureaucrat, we're not bureaucrats. We're always ministers. And so no matter what kind of ministry you're called to do, it might be direct ministry, doing parish life every day with people, or it might be indirect ministry, but it's all ministry. And as long as we keep that focus, it all has a purpose. And our purpose there was to serve the Holy Father and to serve the Holy See in a way of making sure that the Holy Father and those who work closest with him are always close to the people of God. So it is a ministry in that sense. So it was very interesting. And then I was sent here. And of course, now here I still work for the Holy See, but now as an international entity and as the Holy See has its own diplomatic corps. And the diplomatic corps, of course, has ambassadors as well as a number of other diplomats who work together with the heads of mission. And so right now I'm a head of mission for 5 countries, and I work as an ambassador accredited to the government, but I also act as the principal interlocutor with the local churches here. We have 3 bishops' conferences here, and I act as the major interlocutor with them to make sure that their needs, their desires, their hopes, their challenges, especially during these times in particular, are sent back to the Holy See and that the Holy Father is aware of it, but also to make sure that things that the Holy Father needs to be shared with his bishops and with his local church is also, we act as a conduit of that information for the local churches. So that's in a nutshell kind of what we do.
Can you give an example? So I was watching another interview of a talk that you gave, and you gave a really good example of how you can be effective. And you gave the example of 2 young German missionaries.
Yeah. That was a case that came up when I was at the Vatican a number of years ago. We had 2 young ladies who had gone to a country in Africa to work in the missions. And they had just kind of gone off the map. They disappeared. And what happened is eventually someone from the German government, through the embassy there, called and asked if the Holy See could get any information. And we were able to go to the local church. First of all, we went to the Nuncio in that country. The Nuncio contacted the local church where they had last been sent. The local bishop was able to send out some feelers to the local parishes and mission stations. And they found the young ladies working with some nuns in a very remote mission station. So they sent the word back, and we got word back. It says, no, they're fine. They're just in a place that's a real bush place, and there's not a lot of communication there, but they're doing fine. So that was the kind of work we've been able to do. And there's a lot of other examples of that, of where we're able to get a little information that can help others, either other countries or families or people who need some help to find out something about someone.
So you're in Africa right now, and there's all this sadness and poverty and suffering. Like, how do you not get overwhelmed with that?
Well, I think that it does have an effect on you. Anytime that you are in the face of suffering, I think unless you're some kind of a machine, you're going to be affected by it. But this is why I think it's good to have a podcast such as yours. I mean, we're lucky that as people of faith, we bring that to prayer. And I think that contextualizing those things in our faith, in our prayer lives, in the Gospels, really helps us to be able to serve in a way that maybe doesn't always understand the suffering, but is able to at least incorporate it in our own lives, to pray about it, and to do what we can to help alleviate it as much as possible. So, we might just be, as Mother Teresa said, a drop of water in a big ocean. But it takes a lot of drops to make up the ocean. And so I think even our little that we can do can have an effect.
Well, that's a perfect transition. We're about halfway through our podcast, and we do want to talk about how you pray. It's been such a year and a half of suffering all over the world, because of COVID and the isolation. And that was part of the reason we started our podcast, because people were at home. They weren't even able to go to Mass, and we just wanted to have some kind of ministry to bring hope, hope to the world. So I really like your image of, even though we're just one drop in the ocean, we can affect change. So you were influenced by the Benedictines at St. Meinrad's, the Jesuits at the Gregorian. You've lived in several parts of the world. You've traveled all over the world to see people practicing their faith. What draws your heart? How do you pray today? What does a day with Archbishop Wells in prayer look like?
I'll tell you what, it has been for me. The lasting effect has been the Benedictine formation, I would say. Maybe it's because my whole life, my dad, went to school with the Benedictines at St. Gregory's. My mom had been to school with the Benedictines. There's kind of like a Benedictine spirit around us. And when I went off to St. Meinrad, I was always very touched by their prayer, by the way they prayed, and in particular by the principle of Lectio Divina, what that means and how you pray with a text or with the Gospels. And so I tend to still incorporate that in my prayer life. My prayer tends to be very gospel-oriented or very much oriented in some kind of a spiritual text, something that I'm reading, and I typically use that as my point of departure. And so, like, in our life here, we have a lot, we've all had a lot of time to pray in the last year and a half, especially in lockdown, which has been very wonderful. It's also been challenging. But I tell you, some of the things that I have found over the years, I always think it's important to set your prayer just like everything else. You schedule your life. You schedule the time to go to the gym. You schedule the time to eat your lunch. We live a very scheduled life like monks here. And we also schedule our prayer. And so in the morning, I do my prayer in the chapel for the Blessed Sacrament, and then we have Mass. And then during the day, I think it's also important to have a place in your room or a place in your house where you go to pray. I have one chair. This is my prayer chair. Now, it's not, I use it for other stuff too. But when I pray, I always go to that chair. And I think it's kind of a sense of making a place for the sacred, even in your living room or in your dining room or in here. It's in my study. There's a place I go that I pray. And that's where I do my hours and the brief other hours when I'm not in the chapel. And that's where I do my meditation. Most of the time before I go to bed, I do my meditation there as well. So those things for me are particularly important in my prayer life, is routine and also this idea of finding something to help. Prayer is a conversation. It's a conversation between friends. And there's always going to be challenges in it, just as there is in any conversation with friends. I was thinking the other day, we were supposed to originally have our interview on the Feast of Mary Magdalene. And I had done my lectio that day on the gospel. And I was just thinking about what an incredible example that gospel is. It's John 20, it's part of John 20, that gospel that day. And it's an excellent example of the personal relationship that one has with Jesus in their prayer life. When you think of the story of Mary, there are three principal things that I think are fantastic. First of all, Mary goes to find Jesus, and she doesn't find him. She sees somebody, but she doesn't recognize who it is. I was thinking, how often in our prayer, or how often in our Christian lives, do we fail to recognize Jesus? How often maybe it's because we're wanting a particular response and we're not getting it, that we don't recognize what's just right in front of our face. Or how often in our lives interacting and doing our ministry, Do we not realize that Jesus is right there beside us, ministering with us? And I think that's the image that I got when I think about Mary Magdalene, who didn't recognize him first. That's why. The second image is that when she sees this man, she thinks it's a gardener. Now, if you think about that for a minute, why a gardener? It's odd. Why doesn't she think it's a mourner or one of the soldiers or someone else taking a walk in the garden? But why a gardener who's come to put some daffodils in front of the tomb of a man who's a criminal? It just doesn't make a lot of sense. But it does make sense if you think about it, that in our lives, in our relationship with Christ, especially in prayer, he is the gardener. He's the one who planted the seed. He's the one who nurtures the seed. And he's the one who continues to give us everything we need to make sure that that seed grows and it flourishes and it bears fruit. And so it makes perfect sense that he's the gardener. And then finally, the third thing that that came to me that day, and I think it's quite common, and we read it in the commentaries, but it's always stuck with me, is that she does not realize and recognize him until he calls her by name. It's only when he says Mary. Then she knows who he is immediately. Maybe it was the tone of his voice. Maybe it was a way he always said in a teasing way, a Mary or something like the way he said it to her. But that's when she recognizes him. And for me, that says how personal our relationship is with Jesus in prayer. It is a relationship of friends speaking one to another. It's not a transcendent relationship. He's not just speaking to generic human beings. Whenever I go to my prayer, Christ is speaking to Peter Wells. He's speaking to Sharon Hanish when she goes to her prayer. And also at the same time, we're speaking to Jesus, our friend and our brother. This is a very important thing for me in the context of my prayer life. And that's kind of how my prayer works in the sense of Lectio Divina. I try to find something that I can reflect on a daily basis.
I love that. And, I, too, do Lectio. There's a great app called, if anybody's listening, it's called Ritual. And there's a woman from St. John's in Minnesota. She takes you through. I'm an auditory person, but you can just click it in every day. She takes you through the gospel 3 times. And anyway, for anybody who's listening who wants to try out Lectio, I love your reflection. It was very moving for me. Right now, I think sometimes it's hard to find Jesus, and even Mary Magdalene had trouble, so she was a great follower of Jesus. So how has your prayer changed over the years? Like, do you get to go on a retreat? Do you have a spiritual director?
Yes. I go on retreat every year. Every priest is supposed to make a retreat yearly, so I make a yearly retreat. And usually I have a confessor who comes in to the Nuncio. We have a priest that comes, a Franciscan, and he kind of acts as a spiritual director as well. So I do have those things at my disposal. I would say that our prayer life, everyone's prayer matures. And I think as you grow older, I know, don't say anything about age, no jokes about age.
Father Ben.
You've known me for 30 years, Sharon. So but I think that one of the things that I find is my relationship to the Gospels changes every time I hear it. They never get old. And the more mature you become, the more you understand them in a different way. What that Gospel of Mary Magdalene means to me today is so much different than what it meant to me 30 years ago. And I think this is because of the way that our relationship in prayer is a personal relationship. And just as friendships change, so your relationship with Jesus changes. It grows and it becomes different. And so, there's always these obstacles to prayers. I think that all of us we go through times when prayer maybe seems not as efficacious, that we don't get the feedback that we want. But there's also something to be said about old people. When you see an old couple, for instance, they can just sit for hours without talking. and they know exactly what the other one's thinking. They don't really need to say anything. And I think that also in our prayer life, we reach a point in our relationship with Christ, which is like that too, where a lot of times it's just being in the presence. This is where we're so wonderful to have a Eucharistic faith. Being in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament is so important. And it means so much, even if your heart is not speaking or you don't have much, just to be in the presence of our Lord in the sacrament is such a comfort. And it's kind of like what I remember my grandparents used to sit and watch TV together, and they wouldn't say anything for hours. Kind of the same thing. They were just in each other's presence. They really didn't. It didn't matter whether one talked or not.
And yeah, like in any relationship, like you said, it matures and it changes. In your relationship with the Lord and in your prayer life, was there kind of any moment when it was difficult or hard to pray? You've got through a lot of transitions, maybe in those moments, or?
I have to be honest with you, and I never feel like there was a moment that I really had a dark night of the soul as such. I love John of the Cross. I love Teresa of Avila. I love even Mother Teresa. And I read about these great mystics. Maybe I'm not a mystic. That's the problem. I read about these mystics that had these really dark moments. And I really haven't said that I can't say that I've had a dark moment. There have been times that have been less fruitful than others. And that's when I love to go back to what Teresa of Avila said. I remember this since I was a young seminarian. She talks about when she talks about living, she talks about those three phases where that sometimes our prayer, it's like living in a little cabin in the middle of the winter. And sometimes for prayer, we have to go all the way down to the bottom of the hill with a bucket and getting water out of the stream. And then we run back up the hill as fast as we can, spill half of it. By the time we get back up to our cabin, there's just about an inch of water left in. Other times, there's a stream right outside the cabin. So you just go a few yards and you dip the water in and you can take it back. And then every once in a while, not often, but once in a while, the heavens open and the water pours down and the rain fills the well. And the rain fills the stream, and the rain fills all your buckets, and you can exist a long time on that water. So I've always thought that is a great example of what prayer is like, because sometimes our prayer life, we really do have to trudge all the way down the hill and dip into the well, and then half of it spills out, and by the time we get up, I just think it's normal. And I think sometimes it's that way with our relationships with people. Sometimes our relationships get a little rocky. They're not so great. We have to go down. We have to work. We have to work for it. But other times they're wonderful. And those wonderful times which really bleed over and make sure that the times that aren't so great, still you can exist. And I think there's a really apt example of what prayer is about.
You're right about that. Some days are better than others in terms of prayer. We just got to keep at it. So, is there anything that if you could ask everyone in the world, all our millions of listeners, we don't really have millions, all our 10 listeners, to pray, join you in praying for something specific, what would that be?
I'll tell you what I would really ask right now. It's just something that's become very, I think, clear during this pandemic, and particularly in places like Africa and a lot of the developing world. There is a real problem right now with gender violence and violence against women and children, both. And we see it every single day. And this pandemic has exacerbated it, at least here, for so many different reasons. But I think it's something that needs to always be in our mind. How many women and children are suffering daily just to put food on the table? How many I see these young single mothers in the townships, maybe someone who's HIV positive, and she's lost her job. She's living now in a terrible, she doesn't know where her food's going to come from the next day. And I just think we have to keep these people always at the front of our lives, in front of our mind, in the front of our eyes, because we are so fortunate in so many ways, and we've been so blessed. And there's so many others who are struggling for every moment just to make sure their child has milk. And we can't forget that. We can't forget that. And that's what makes, like I say, we talked about this earlier. We can be a drop of water. Even our prayer can be another drop of water in that ocean. Maybe we can't go out that day and give them a food parcel, but we can pray for them. And it does make a difference. It makes a big difference. So that's what I would ask for people to pray for at this time. And not forget those who are marginalized, and those whom, especially during this period, have even become more marginalized.
Wow. We will pray for the marginalized, for those that are suffering. Is there any, before we sign off, do you have a recommendation of a particular, like, Catholic Relief Services, or is there a place?
Yes. CRS is always does great work. I mean, we see it here all the time. I think in the States you don't see it as much because all their work is done, overseas. But we see it, and CRS has been really helpful. They're part of the great Caritas International umbrella, and Caritas has been absolutely essential in this period in places like where I live in Southern Africa, but throughout all of Africa, in many places in Asia, elsewhere. I mean, the work that has been done over the last 18 months is incredible. And it's a real sign of God's mercy and the way God's mercy works through the church and allows us to be instruments of his love and compassion to others, which is such a great gift. And we're so lucky as Catholics to have that gift at our disposal.
Well, okay, Mike, we'll put a link to that in the show notes. And we're so grateful you joined us. You're just one of the smartest, funniest people I know. And we're old now, not just old friends. But we have Father Vince here to keep us young. And so we're so grateful you joined us.
We're aging, I like to say.
We're aging. Oh, my gosh.
Like fine wine and cheese.
Yes, that's going to be my image moving forward. Yeah. So will you lead us in a Glory Be to wrap up our podcast?
Certainly. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you all so much, and God bless you.
Glory Be is a production of the Office of Communications at the Church of St. Mary in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I'm your producer, Mike Malcolm. See you next time.